Hey, keep your voice down. I gotta be quick before the main video starts. In case you missed it, I'm writing a comic. It's called Aurora, and the first print volume is coming out really soon, like this week. And if you're watching this video later, not the day it came out, it's just out. It exists in like bookstores and stuff, which is so weird to think about. Anyway, if a fantasy, superhero-ish comic sounds interesting, you can pre-order or just order the book, and or you can read the whole comic online at comicaurora.com. Various links about that are in the description, and yeah! Shoot, it's the fuzz! Quick, roll the video! There's an old saying that truth is stranger than fiction, and I don't think there are any fields that prove that more comprehensively than physics and chemistry. In our attempts to model the seemingly intuitive works of the material world, such as fire hot and things fall down, we've stumbled upon near-infinite rabbit holes of fundamental forces barely perceptible to human senses and the logic of chemical reactions occurring on a scale far too small for us to see, underpinned by the complex quantum dance of even more unseeable subatomic particles and the energies concealed therein. People have been trying to model observable reality for longer than we've been people, and all things considered, our current models seem to be pretty good. We've got the periodic table mostly filled out, we've been finding those particles the math indicates have to exist to make the equations balance, chemical reactions can be modeled in advance rather than just mixing concoctions to see what goes boom, black holes look about how we expected them to. But it took us a long-ass time to get here, and frankly, the model we currently have is, not intuitive. It can't be. The way the world works on a fundamental level, on the smallest scale where the rules are hiding, is not really how the world looks like it works on the level humans live at and form their intuition around. When people hear that 99.9% of an atom is empty space, that doesn't gel with the fact that they can touch a rock and it feels solid. The world we observe versus the underlying forces that make it work that way are separated from each other by many layers of abstraction. This is why I stuck with pure mathematics. All this applied stuff gave me a headache. Historically, there have been many attempts to model reality, to lock in simple mechanical rules that explain why everything works the way it does. Perhaps the heavens seem to circle around the earth because we live at the center of the universe and are cosmically designated as God's favorite princess. Perhaps certain things burn while others don't because they contain the element phlogiston, which is released in the form of the flame. Perhaps storms form over the sea because the god of the oceans is a temperamental bitch baby who likes causing problems. Maybe hanging around dead bodies makes you sick because of all the angry ghosts, or because they make the air go bad, or maybe it's because the world is full of invisible little guys that sneak inside your body to fuck you up. The real world really only looks intuitive because we're used to it. The actual mechanisms that drive its functionality are, appropriately, ridiculously complex. Arguably too complex. Which is why, when a writer world builds a fictional setting, they usually stop well before they have to start considering molecular chemistry or germ theory. A fictional world doesn't need to make sense down to the quarks and gluons, it just needs to hold together well enough to feel immersive, which means when it comes to modeling the physical properties of the universe, lots of writers will drop back to an older, simpler model of the real world for inspiration. After all, you don't need to world build the periodic table and all the chemistry implications thereof if you can just break the world down into a simple single-digit number of elements that govern the function of reality, which might go a long way towards explaining the enduring popularity of the elemental magic system. The logic at the root of an elemental magic system is essentially that the world at large and its corresponding concept of magic, whatever form that takes or name it uses, can be cleanly subdivided along categorical lines associated with specific elements, with different branches of magic typically built on controlling or summoning those elements. An elemental magic system is generally on the harder end of the world-building spectrum, with more rigidly defined rules than soft magic systems that operate more on vibes. If nothing else, it's very common for elemental magic systems to be extremely clear about what falls under the purview and capabilities of the various elements, to strictly delineate the world building and sort it cleanly into the provided elemental boxes. Characters in these stories will usually have a strong thematic association with a specific element that they can magically connect with or harness in some way. But in some stories, elemental magic is instead just one branch of a larger magic system with many more flavors of magic to choose from. In these instances, elemental magic is the branch that specifically involves calling on the power of nature for aid. In these larger magic systems, rather than specializing into a single element, it's more common for characters to be masters of elemental magic in general, which allows the mage in question to call on the natural world in a way that less environmentally attuned people can't. In contrast, other magically inclined party members might do things like stop time, or fire off bolts of nondescript blurple energy, or crack open portals to have tea with Cthulhu. Elemental magic as a whole exists in a much smaller box in these stories. But in stories where the elemental magic system is the whole magic system, most characters are going to specialize into one specific elemental branch. The elements in an elemental magic system can vary a lot, but But a safe bet will usually start with the Aristotelian elements, water, earth, fire, and air, or with the 5 classical Chinese elements, fire, water, wood, metal, and earth. These mainstays were foundational to historical elemental models of the universe, and they're popular for a reason. They're relatively intuitive. They work like how the universe feels like it works. If you squint, most things can be loosely sorted into these elemental categories. This means the author will know exactly what their elemental magic users will be capable of and what they won't without having to deal with too many elementally ambiguous edge cases. Elemental magic systems are usually very literal. A fire person can throw fireballs, a wood person can grow plants, a wind person can maybe fly. An interesting little side note here is that this is a much more physical interpretation of the elemental system than either Hellenistic philosophy or the 5 phases were intended for. When ancient Greek philosophers locked in the 4 classical elements, they were abstracting them pretty heavily, to the point where they basically reduced all 4 elements down to 2 components each. Are they hot or cold, and are they dry or wet? So hot and dry makes fire, hot and wet makes air, wet and cold makes water, and cold and dry makes earth. In this model, 100% of everything could be explained by sorting it into one of these abstract categories or combining the independently unique properties of these roots of reality. And if something didn't seem like it could be explained that way, it definitely could, we just didn't know how yet. When Hippocrates of Hippocratic Oath fame later popularized the 4 humors model of medicine, elemental associations quickly followed, associating blood with air, yellow bile with fire, black bile with earth, and phlegm with water. And these got associated with seasons, respectively spring, summer, fall, and winter. And these also got linked with personality traits, namely friendly, angry, lazy, and depression. So the 4 classical elements were getting used in a very non-literal way to categorize everything from medical problems to weather patterns. Meanwhile, the 5 phases model was always more abstractly focused on interactions between the things the elements represented rather than properties of those literal elements, which isn't too surprising when you realize that of the 5 elements listed, air is not one of them, meaning it's clearly not about physically listing every kind of material in the world. The model started off with planetary associations before the elements were brought into it, leading to a smorgasbord of correlation where metal is west and autumn and white and also the planet Venus, wood is east and green and also springtime and also wind and thunder and the planet Jupiter, etc. The elements all interact with one another in different transformative ways, passing through a cycle of one feeding into the other and one conquering another. The cycles are meant to model the function of the world, but the physical elements are only being invoked in a very conceptual way. Heck, many of the main characters in Journey to the West are explicitly referred to with an elemental association that never translates into what we would think of as elemental magic. Just because a character is associated with wood doesn't mean they actually have anything aesthetically or magically to do with plants. And I think there's a very interesting underlying clash to be found here between historical elemental systems, which were developed in an attempt to model the real workings of the whole understood universe, and fictional elemental systems, which are baked into the world building from the ground up. A writer that builds a fictional world from scratch usually starts from the underlying rules of this new reality and extrapolates from these first principles, building only things that either make direct sense based on these rules or are simply too cool for them to leave out. But in the historical philosophies that these elemental systems draw on, bluntly, the world didn't care if it conformed to the model or not. Historical elemental systems weren't clean-cut speculative world building, they were trying to lock down the building blocks of reality that would explain everything from the movement of the wandering stars to the chronic illnesses that plagued them. So fire wasn't just physical burning, it was also the season of summer, the refining flames of the forge, the concept of a hot temper, the planet Mars, the cardinal direction south where the warm came from. Because all those things existed and needed categorization. But when a writer world builds from the ground up, this process occurs in reverse. The writer constructs categories and fills them with ideas that make sense with the rules established. So a fictional elemental magic system will almost never capture the weird, esoteric complexities of the historical philosophies they draw on because they don't need to. The fictional magic system can just be a part of the way the world works instead of having to account for everything. Also, frankly, many historical elemental systems ran up against the foundational problem that they were, incorrect. They didn't actually model the world in any sort of comprehensive way, which meant they'd keep encountering edge cases or unexplainable phenomena that defied categorization. The historical field of alchemy, which was very obsessed with the elements and their properties and how they could be combined and refined for power, was like 90% absolute hot nonsense focused on things like soul refinement and homunculus construction and the philosopher's stone, and the remaining 10% that actually worked just turned into real chemistry and the real periodic table. A lot of these historical elemental systems also encountered the roadblock of what the hell was going on with outer space. It had to be made of something, but it didn't seem to act like any of the known things on Earth. The stars glowed and flickered like fire, but they didn't seem to be consuming anything or releasing any smoke. They didn't usually move independent of one another, and they all traced out big circles, whereas most things on Earth liked moving in straight lines. The moon and sun had to be made of something, but if the moon was stone, why didn't it fall? And if the sun was fire, why didn't it burn out? There's something fishy going on here. In a fictional setting with tangible elemental magic, these problems don't apply. If the elemental categorization is real and foundational, then the world must work in an overall simpler way than the one these historical elemental systems were made for. Because of this, elemental magic systems can get really weird with what they classify as an element. One common addition to the 4 or 5 element system is a secret bonus element, often called ether or quintessence, drawing on another Aristotelian concept, which was essentially and all the other stuff that doesn't fit this existing model. Quintessence was an explanation for why space and the stars didn't seem to fit into the categorization of hot versus cold and wet versus dry that defined everything on Earth. Obviously, there was a 5th element up there with its own weird properties that explained everything and liked going in circles, I guess. As a general catch-all, ether is very useful in a given elemental magic system because it can cover stuff like energy or souls or magic itself that don't cleanly fit into the pre-existing elemental boxes. Since its whole definition is the secret extra thing that makes the system work, it can be pretty cleanly integrated into any elemental magic system if the writer wants to throw in something new. It also has the benefit that in an elemental-themed 5-man band, making the leader associated with a secret special element lets the writer justify them having all kinds of bullshit powers that their teammates can't access. Some stories will also subdivide the elements into much more specific categories. Most commonly, ice can get carved off into being its own thing rather than just a subcategory of water. So you'll get characters with only ice powers and no apparent control over liquid or gaseous water except by freezing it. This is one of those divisions that doesn't make the most sense mechanically or on a granular world-building level, but absolutely works on vibes. Ice feels like a different kind of thing than water, even if it isn't, so giving it its own little zone of magic isn't the weirdest thing in the world. Because again, the elemental magic system model is simplified and largely vibes-based. It doesn't need to follow the considerations of real physics and chemistry because neither does the rest of it. Although the more blatantly the elemental magic system breaks the real conventions of chemistry and physics, the more likely it is that the audience will start getting frustrated as their understanding of what the rules are gets shakier and shakier. There's kind of a balance to strike here. Just because it's vibes-based doesn't mean you can exactly get away with whatever you want without losing some audience investment, but There are also a few different schools of thought around lightning. In more modern aesthetic settings, characters with electricity powers are extremely common, because electricity is an understood part of the modern world, and we can get a clear feel for what it might mean for a character to control it. But in the ye olden times fantasy aesthetic, electricity means lightning, and lightning means storms. So it feels a bit like a thing of its own, defying most categorization, but not all of it. In itself, lightning is a bright, hot expression of energy, a lot like fire. So correlating the two isn't uncommon, but neither is partitioning it off into its own element, where weather control or storm magic or power over thunder gets to be a slice of magic all on its own. Some elemental magic systems will include things as elements that sort of strain the definition of an element. Shadow magic, for instance, is a popular one to enable some good old-fashioned edgy boys to work their shenanigans. So is its counterpoint of light, but you can also get things like poison, technology, sound, gravity, and the concept of death. At this point, the word element is kind of losing all meaning, but the good thing about fantasy world building is that anything can be an element if it's elemental to reality. If music is magic, then maybe sound is elemental. If death is an inevitability, maybe it does count as a foundational power in the universe. If darkness is the primordial medium of the universe from which the light first sprung, tapping into that could do all kinds of interesting things. I think this only feels weird and nitpickable because from a modern standpoint, we understand what an element actually is, and it's not what these historical elemental models used that word for. It's a box on the periodic table with a specific number of protons in it, and that makes it behave a certain way because reasons. There's no sound element because sound is a process, a wave moving through a medium. There's no darkness element because it's just the absence of light. And there's no light element because photons are their own thing that don't involve protons at all, which would arguably make it its own kind of thing, but the point is that the word element means something and photons don't count. Calling poison an element disregards the huge different number of compounds, organic and inorganic, that are poisonous. Almost like how calling earth an element ignores the huge different number of compounds, organic and inorganic, organic, that are dirt. I'm a grade A nitpicker. I love pointing out when things don't make sense, but if we're starting from the premise that a fictional world has an elemental magic system, we have no picks to nitpick with. The premise is already so many steps removed from the way our world actually works. There's no law that says you have to stick to the old elemental models when you're building a new one from the ground up. So maybe poison can be an element too. Who cares? This used to make me so mad, and now I'm madder that I've convinced myself it's not actually a problem. In the Aristotelian-inspired models, with only the 4 classical elements as a foundation, plants will often still be partitioned off as their own domain, because they don't really fit cleanly into any of the big 4. They're kind of arguably splitting custody between water and earth, so they'll either get bundled under one of them or branched off into their own school of magic. Plant magic is a very useful concept to include, but it also carries some complicated implications, because on a structural level, the difference between a plant and a person is not as large as one might want. If we're using magic to manipulate cellular growth, does the magic care if the thing it's changing has a rigid cell wall and chloroplasts, or can it do that to anything alive, making it the most terrifying OP form of magic in the world? This is one of those fun world-building questions that gets given a lot of answers to keep the power from getting too horrifically overpowered. In the setting of DC Comics, which is absolutely choco with plant people, the answer is a strong no, because plants are all connected to this primordial force called the green, and superpowers associated with it almost always involve tapping into the green. Animals are another department entirely, and therefore exempt from green stuff. The magic works if you're a plant. How can it tell? Well, obviously plants have the cosmic is a plant seal of approval, so the magic works on them. Alien plants? If they're plants, they're plants. Plants that think they're a dead guy? Still a plant. It's really harkening back to the olden days of elemental categorization. This is a kind of earth because, look at it, it's a rock. Is this metal a kind of earth? Well, is it a rock? Yes? Then yes, it's earth. It's a fun bit of circular logic. Historical elemental systems had to work off of observed reality, which meant every categorization was going to start from vibes. Dirt, rocks, metal, it's all earth, until you start breaking it down and seeing how the individual components of it work differently from one another. Water is its own thing because look at the ocean. Nothing else works like that. Air is everything we breathe, and fire is the problem child that has to be its own thing because it clearly doesn't work like anything else. The current understanding of elements is almost completely vibeless. Elements mostly get subdivided by atomic number, not by how they look, feel, or smell. You can do a middle school experiment to electrolyze water into hydrogen and oxygen, and determine if you've gotten hydrogen by lighting a match under the test tube. If it goes pop, congratulations! Chemistry is still working as intended. You have just turned water into air that explodes. But to create a fictional world where any given elemental magic system is correct, you basically have to create a world that partitions itself meaningfully based on aesthetic. You have to throw out the periodic table at the door because it's well below the scale we're going to be operating on. A thing is an element if it is a category that cannot be contained in any other extant category. The actual internal mechanics of the thing have no bearing on this categorization. If it looks like a rock, it's a rock. If the universe says it's a plant, it's a plant. If it's hot and it glows, it's fire. If you start talking about cells and molecules and chemical reactions, the whole vibes-based categorization falls apart, just like the way real alchemy did. Now, this microscale hand-waving is very much not a universal requirement for a story with an elemental magic system, because not every world with an elemental magic system uses that elemental system for its physical foundations. There are a lot of elemental magic systems that are sort of layered on top of the more familiar, broader world that doesn't cleanly categorize itself into only the elements displayed. Castlevania and its sequel series Nocturne feature elemental magic subdivided into fire, ice, and lightning, but it never pretends like these are the only 3 elements the world is made of. They're just the ones that make for the best projectile attacks. In stories like Avatar: The Last Airbender, check it off your bingo cards and admire my restraint for taking this long to name drop it, things are a little more vague. The world is mostly composed of the big 4 elements, and even boundary breakers like plants, lightning, metal, and lava are eventually shown to be under the purview of one or more category of benders. It's not until the sequel series Korra that they introduce a substance that no bender can affect. And that's also when they started getting really weird with the world building anyway, so nah. But at the same time, it's broadly shown through Sokka's shenanigans that chemistry mostly works. This world has enough underlying physics to resemble the mechanics of reality we know in the real world, while simultaneously allowing for the clean subdivision of everything into 4 magical delineations, which works for what it is, because for the most part, the audience isn't going to demand a full breakdown of of which elements on the periodic table are under the purview of which kinds of bending before they'll suspend their disbelief about the flying bison, but I'll admit, my personal taste in the writing department is a little bit different. If I were to build my own elemental system, I wouldn't want to have to be vague about where the boundaries were. I'd want to make sure that I, at least, knew the rules all the way down. This also feels like the point where I kind of have to address an elephant in the room, which is that I have built an elemental magic system. I built it myself for use in my comic Aurora. Remember from the ad at the beginning of the video? So this is a trope that I have a kind of different perspective on than a lot of the ones I've unpacked in this series. Most of my trope analysis comes predominantly from an audience perspective, where I try to piece together patterns across different stories I've seen and how these writers have answered the same question in different circumstances. This is one trope I've actually contributed to, so I'm gonna very gently break my one rule for these trope talks and use my own writing as an example. Not necessarily as a good example, to be 100% clear. This isn't how to make the best elemental magic system. This is what I learned making my own elemental magic system at age 11 after watching through the entire Last Airbender DVD box set on a road trip. I'm not a metric of quality, I'm just having a good time. I gave myself one hard limit early on to avoid going mad. I was not allowed to world build a periodic table. I had to stop before I hit the level of molecular chemistry. It could exist in the world, but I wasn't allowed to write it out in detail, because at that point I would have entirely lost the plot on what needed to be built for the world to hold together. It needed to look enough like reality to support the existence of familiar-looking plants, animals, and people, because I wanted the baseline of the world to have a familiar aesthetic that wasn't too hard to click into. But I also wanted it to break down cleanly along elemental lines. So the solution I came up with was to start from the elements and build literally everything up from there. I locked down the 6 elements I wanted to use for the purposes of the narrative I wanted to tell, which basically meant what kinds of magic do I want these guys to be able to throw at each other. I started with wind, water, fire, and stone to cover the basics, stone instead of earth because obviously this planet wasn't gonna be Earth, so that would just be confusing, plus lightning because I didn't want to be basic, and as a final kicker, an element I was calling life in the abstract to account for plant magic, healing magic, and anything on the spectrum in between. And then, rather than layering this elemental system on top of an existing world fitting the aesthetic I'd been building in my mind, I decided to scrap the initial aesthetic ideas and literally build the world out of those elements from the ground up and see what I got. So each element got a massive godlike being I was calling a primordial, probably because I was playing a lot of Exalted at the time. A primordial would be like moon-sized and have a body completely physically composed of the element that it was, and a soul composed of a unique kind of energy that was associated with that element. So the stone primordial was a big stone guy with a soul made out of stone energy, the fire primordial was a big fire thing with a soul made out of fire energy, etc., etc. Then I let them all die in a big cataclysmic battle against a primordial force of evil, and when they died I had them fuse their 6 elemental bodies together into a mostly indestructible prison for that elemental evil. Just like that, I had a world in the making, composed of these 6 primordial corpses just lying around, with plenty of wind, water, and stone to get the aesthetic right, fire and lightning to keep things interesting, and life oozing around to kickstart an ecosystem. And of course with a big primordial evil slumbering at the center of it, because you know I gotta. Some unfathomable number of eons later, a mix of evolution and intentional divine intervention could populate this world I made with people, plants, and animals that were aesthetically familiar to an Earth-based audience, plus as many additional wacky things as I wanted and could think of. The magic system would involve characters channeling the unique energy of each dead elemental primordial's soul that used to compose their living soul, and thus each element in this world could correspondingly be magically commanded by only the once living soul it had held. So a fire mage would be channeling the soul of fire through themselves into animating some actual physical fire, so they could throw fire at stuff. You know, really simple stuff. Because I'd introduced the concept of primordial fusion, any material that didn't seem to cleanly fit into one of the 6 categories could be explained as, essentially, a molecular-level fusion of 2 or more elements, gaining new and unexpected properties from their combination, including the aforementioned plot-relevant perfect fusion of all 6 elements that was indestructible enough to contain an ancient primordial evil. This is as far down as I let myself get in the world building. Essentially the part where I would have to start reinventing molecular chemistry from first principles, which again, my one rule was that I was not allowed to do that. And that felt like a good place where I could start hand-waving. After all, in real chemistry, chlorine is a toxic gas disallowed by the Geneva Conventions, and sodium is a highly reactive metal that explodes when you get it wet. But if you fuse them, you get ordinary table salt. And that's the kind of emergent, weird bullshit that I like in a magic system. So every living thing on this world could be constructed from molecule-scale fusions of the 6 elemental materials that once composed the 6 elemental primordials. And if they seem to have weird properties that don't follow from the obvious physical properties of the elements involved, out, that's probably because the fusion has emergent properties and dead Titanic space gods have more going on under the hood than just being a big rock. I did, then, have one exciting new problem. Namely, that in my effort to make this magic system universally consistent, I had made it much too powerful. Like bloodbending times 100, everyone's body was physically composed of all the elements, meaning any mage, even if they could only control a single element, would have something they could mess with. For the sake of aesthetic and interesting fight choreography, I did not want every wizard battle to be a competition of who could switch off the other guy's brain faster. So I added in the equivalent of a quintessence X factor. Anything that has a soul, which is crucially not made of the same kind of energy as the 6 primordial souls were, and is instead composed of a different kind of energy that nobody can directly control, has a strong resistance to any kind of magic, because it prevents the intrusion of an elemental energy required to make that magic happen. Soul energy is mysterious, uncontrollable, permeates everything, and forms magic-resistant lattices in all sufficiently complex living things and some non-living structures and substances. So you're not allowed to just pull someone's blood out. You have to fling a good, honest fireball like anyone else. And this also gave me ways to narratively shut down mages if I wanted to make them struggle in a situation they could otherwise potentially magic their way out of. There was a lot more world building after this point. I wanted to make sure the magic system worked aesthetically the way I wanted it to, while still holding together on a rules level. And it got more layers of complexity the more I tweaked it. The primordials became more complex in their nature. The magic systems developed layers of complexity as they could delve into the nuances that these living primordials once had. I found a pretty clean way to explain why healing magic could work if the soul was preventing magical intrusion in the body. The idea is that a wound damages the soul, so that in that location, the soul can't protect the body from magical intrusion, which means healing magic can be applied. But also, if you're nasty enough about it, you could potentially pull somebody's blood out like a little bit through it before the soul heals over. Anyway, it was a whole project, just trying to find a way to make this thing hold together internally while also producing the kind of aesthetic world that I wanted my characters to be able to play around in. But by laying the foundations like this, with these 6 elements locked in from minute 1, I always had a pretty good feel for what was possible, what was very difficult, and what was impossible for any given character in any given situation. And that felt, to me, like the most important part of the elemental magic system, far more important than working out the cellular biology of a person with fire literally in their blood. By partitioning the world, it makes it very clear who can do what. It lets the writer know exactly how to challenge their characters, what tasks will be trivial, and what will be insurmountable. Because ultimately, when building a world, I tend to think of it like building a playground. I usually think the characters are the most interesting part of any story, and the world they live in is the primary factor that both shapes them and gives them stuff to do. That world needs to hold together, at least under normal levels of wear and tear, but it doesn't need to actually be as ironclad as the physical laws of actual reality. It's okay, I'd say arguably even necessary, if some part of the story answers how does this work with a hand wave instead of a comprehensive periodic table breakdown. After all, having a complete comprehensive understanding of the world one lives in is tremendously unrealistic. It took us a long-ass time just to get where we are now in the real world, and there's still a lot of unanswered questions about the way our universe holds together. Building a story off an elemental magic system gives the writer a strict framework with which to partition the vibes, and neatly defined parameters around the abilities of the characters so they know how to challenge them, how to beat them, and how to power them up over time. But it's easy to slide down the very same rabbit hole that consumed early alchemists, carving the world into smaller and smaller pieces, hunting for the smallest indivisible unit of reality in order to wholly comprehend the building blocks. These natural philosophers started their analysis from vibes and made their way down to atoms. And that's damn impressive, but a writer building a fictional world for their fictional story can't afford to slide down the same chute. World building is one of my favorite parts of the writing process, but it's so important to know when to stop. And I cannot possibly think of a cleaner way to end this video, so yeah.